The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, cream-colored linen paper with my name written in fountain pen ink so precise it looked like calligraphy. Inside was a single card embossed with gold lettering inviting me to afternoon tea at the Metropolitan Club to discuss matters of mutual concern regarding the estate. No signature. No warmth. Just the assumption that I would appear at the appointed time like a summoned servant. I held the card between my fingers and felt the weight of expensive paper stock chosen specifically to communicate that the person who sent it operated on a different tier of society than I did. The return address was my mother-in-law's Park Avenue penthouse, the kind of address that doesn't need a building number because everyone who matters already knows which building it is. I had been married to her son for 11 years, widowed for 6 months, and this was the first direct communication I had received from her since the funeral, where she wore Chanel and wept elegantly into a monogrammed handkerchief. The invitation didn't ask if I was available. It informed me when I would be expected. And that difference told me everything I needed to know about what kind of conversation awaited me. Before I explain what happened at that tea service, before I detail the institutional cruelty disguised as concern, I want to acknowledge something. If you're here listening to this, you've chosen to spend your time with a stranger's pain. That matters. If this story speaks to something you recognize, consider staying with me through what comes next, because what I'm about to describe isn't just about me, it's about every woman who has been measured and found wanting by people who mistake wealth for wisdom. My name is Margot Sinclair. I'm 37 years old. 6 months ago, my husband died in a sailing accident off the coast of Maine. His body recovered 3 days later from water so cold the medical examiner said he likely lost consciousness within minutes. We had been married since I was 26, together since I was 23, and in all that time I had never fully understood that I wasn't marrying just a man but an entire architecture of expectations I would never be able to satisfy. My husband's family, the Sinclairs, traced their American lineage back to before the Revolution, their wealth accumulated through shipping, then banking, then the kind of diversified portfolio management that turns old money into self-replicating money. They had foundation board seats and museum wings named after them and the kind of social currency that opens doors before you even knock. I had grown up in Ohio, daughter of a high school teacher and a nurse, raised with good values and student loans and the understanding that success meant working hard and being decent. That background made me fundamentally incompatible with people who believed success meant being born correctly. My husband, James, had seemed different when we met. He worked in environmental law, drove a modest car, wore his grandfather's watch not because it was valuable but because he liked the mechanical precision of it. He introduced me to his parents after 6 months of dating, and I remember walking into their apartment thinking it was a hotel lobby, marble floors, museum-quality art, staff in actual uniforms. His mother, Catherine Sinclair, had assessed me with the practiced eye of someone evaluating livestock at auction. She asked about my family, my education, my people, as if ancestry were a resume line. When I mentioned my father taught high school history, she smiled in a way that looked warm but felt arctic. How important, she said. Teachers are the backbone of society. But her tone made it clear that backbones belonged in the background, supporting more important people. James had squeezed my hand under the table and later told me I'd done great, his mother liked me. I believed him because I wanted to, because love makes you interpret coldness as caution and contempt as concern. We married in a ceremony his mother planned down to the font on the place cards. It was beautiful in the way museum exhibits are beautiful, correct, expensive, designed to be photographed. I wore a dress his mother selected, carried flowers his mother chose, walked down an aisle in a church his family had attended for generations while my own parents sat in the third row looking uncomfortable in their rented formal wear. The reception cost more than my father's annual salary. Everyone said it was perfect. I felt like an actress playing a role in someone else's production. The first few years of marriage were a constant education in the ways I was deficient. I held my fork incorrectly at formal dinners. I didn't recognize the names of people I was supposed to know. I laughed too loudly at a charity gala and was later informed by Catherine that discretion in public is a mark of breeding. James defended me in private but never in front of his mother, which meant his defense didn't actually count. I tried to learn the rules, adapt to expectations, smooth my rough edges into something more acceptable. But the more I adapted, the more I realized the problem wasn't my behavior, it was my existence. I hadn't been born into this world, and no amount of etiquette classes or wardrobe consultations would ever make me native to it. We tried for years to have children. Fertility treatments, specialists, procedures that turned intimacy into clinical obligation. Each failed cycle was marked by sympathetic cards from Catherine suggesting we consider adoption from a reputable agency, or perhaps accept that some things aren't meant to be. She never said it directly, but the implication hovered in every conversation. Maybe my inability to conceive was proof that I wasn't suited to carry on the Sinclair line. Then, unexpectedly, impossibly, I became pregnant at 35. The pregnancy was difficult, complicated by preeclampsia that put me on bed rest for the final trimester. James became anxious, hovering, calling his mother for advice instead of the doctor's. Catherine visited weekly, bringing her opinions like casseroles. She suggested I wasn't resting properly, wasn't eating correctly, wasn't managing my stress appropriately. You need to be very careful, she said while arranging imported flowers in a crystal vase. At your age, with your history, there are so many risks. I gave birth to a daughter we named Claire, 7 pounds 3 ounces of perfect health despite every dire prediction Catherine had offered. I held her in the hospital and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of love and protection. James cried when he first held her. His mother looked at her with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "She has the Sinclair forehead." Claire became the center of my entire universe. James adored her but remained peripheral, his work demanding frequent travel and long hours that kept him more absent than present. I didn't mind. My daughter was bright, curious, stubborn in ways that made me proud rather than frustrated. She asked endless questions, built elaborate structures from blocks, insisted on wearing mismatched clothes because patterns don't have to agree to be friends. She was wholly herself in ways I had spent my adult life trying not to be. Catherine visited regularly under the guise of grandmother devotion, but always with an undercurrent of assessment. She commented on Claire's language development, her social skills, her table manners at age 3. It's important to establish proper habits early, she would say. Children from good families are held to higher standards. I smiled and nodded and privately decided that my daughter would never mistake etiquette for character or breeding for worth. Then James died. The sailing trip was supposed to be a weekend with college friends, a chance to decompress before a major case went to trial. The weather turned unexpectedly, a summer squall that came up fast and hit hard. His boat capsized. He wasn't wearing a life vest. By the time the Coast Guard found him, it was already too late. The funeral was enormous, hundreds of people I barely knew offering condolences that felt performative. Catherine stood at the front receiving mourners like a queen granting audiences, her grief on display but somehow contained, appropriate, photogenic. I stood beside her feeling like I was drowning in the same water that had taken my husband, my hands clenched so tight my nails left marks on my palms. People I had never met told me how lucky I was to have been married to James, how fortunate to be part of the Sinclair family, how important it was to preserve his legacy. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked about Claire, who was 5 years old and kept asking when Daddy was coming home because death is an abstraction when you're that young. The weeks after the funeral blurred together, legal meetings, financial advisors, insurance paperwork, the machinery of death in a wealthy family. I learned that James had a trust fund I'd never fully understood, assets I didn't know existed, investments managed by family attorneys who spoke to me like I was a child being introduced to adult concepts. I also learned that everything was complicated, structured, protected by legal mechanisms designed to keep wealth within bloodlines rather than allowing it to flow to people who married in. I signed documents I didn't fully understand because the lawyers assured me everything was standard, everything was normal, everything was for Claire's protection. Catherine attended these meetings, always perfectly composed, always asking questions I hadn't thought to ask, always positioning herself as the responsible party protecting her granddaughter's interests. I was grateful at the time. I thought she was helping. I didn't yet understand that help and control can wear the same face. 3 months after James died, the invitations to family events stopped. Sunday dinners I had attended for 11 years were suddenly happening without me. Catherine's assistant called to cancel our standing lunch dates, citing scheduling conflicts that became permanent. When I asked directly if something was wrong, Catherine assured me that nothing had changed, she was simply busy with foundation work and assumed I needed time to grieve privately. But the message was clear. I had been James's wife, and now that James was gone, my access to the family was provisional, temporary, revocable. I might have accepted this as the natural distance that comes after loss, except for one detail. Catherine's relationship with Claire intensified. She began requesting overnight visits, weekend trips, invitations to events that didn't include me. Claire should know her heritage, Catherine explained when I hesitated. She's a Sinclair, and that comes with responsibilities and opportunities you can't provide on your own. The implication stung precisely because it was partially true. I couldn't give Claire access to that world, that network, that particular form of social capital. But I could give her something Catherine never understood, the freedom to be herself without performance or apology. Then came the invitation to tea. I arrived at the Metropolitan Club 15 minutes early because punctuality had been drilled into me during my marriage, only to be told by staff that Mrs. Sinclair wasn't ready to receive me yet, and would I mind waiting in the library. I sat in a leather chair surrounded by oil paintings of men who looked like they'd never doubted anything in their lives, and tried not to feel like I was being deliberately made to wait as a reminder of my place. When I was finally escorted to the private dining room 40 minutes past the appointed time, Catherine was already seated with tea service arranged on the table, Wedgwood china, silver service, finger sandwiches cut into precise triangles. She didn't apologize for the delay. She simply gestured to the chair across from her and said, "Thank you for coming, Margot. We have important matters to discuss." I sat and waited. Catherine poured tea with practiced grace, added exactly 1 sugar cube to her cup, stirred twice, and set the spoon on the saucer at the correct angle. Every movement was deliberate, designed to demonstrate mastery of rituals I would always perform slightly wrong. "I've been thinking a great deal about Claire's future," she began. "James would have wanted her to have every advantage, every opportunity to thrive in the world she was born into." I nodded because this seemed uncontroversial. Every parent wants advantages for their child. But Catherine continued, her voice smooth as silk over steel. "Unfortunately, I have concerns about whether you're equipped to provide that kind of guidance. You come from a very different background, Margot. You've done your best, and I appreciate the effort, but Claire needs more than effort. She needs breeding, connections, education in the finest institutions, exposure to the right people." The right people. The phrase hung in the air like an indictment. I kept my voice level. "Claire is thriving. She's happy, healthy, excelling in school. She attends public school," Catherine interrupted gently, as if this were a terminal diagnosis. "James attended Buckley, then Exeter, then Yale. Claire should be following that path, but she can't if you insist on raising her like an ordinary child." Ordinary. The word landed like a slap. I set my teacup down carefully because my hands had started to shake. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Catherine dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin before responding. "I'm suggesting that Claire would be better served living primarily with me. I have the resources, the network, the understanding of what her life should look like. You could visit, of course. Holidays, summers perhaps. But her primary residence should be with family who can properly guide her." The room tilted slightly. I heard the words but couldn't quite process them as real. "You want to take my daughter." "I want to raise my granddaughter," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference. You're still her mother, Margot. No one is suggesting otherwise. But motherhood isn't just biology, it's preparation, wisdom, the ability to open doors that will remain closed without the right key. You love Claire. I don't question that. But love isn't enough when a child is heir to a legacy like hers." I should have stood up and walked out. I should have told her to go to hell in the most articulate way possible. But shock has a way of paralyzing you, making you sit still while someone calmly explains why you're inadequate. Catherine continued, warming to her thesis. "I've already spoken with family attorneys. There are provisions in James's trust that give me certain oversight regarding Claire's upbringing. If we determine that her current environment isn't meeting the standards established by the trust, we can petition for a change in custody arrangements. I'd prefer not to make this adversarial, Margot. I'd prefer we come to an understanding privately, as reasonable people who both want what's best for Claire." The threat was delivered with a smile. I found my voice, though it came out thinner than I wanted. You're threatening to sue me for custody of my daughter because I'm not rich enough. Catherine's expression shifted to something like pity. This isn't about money, dear. It's about suitability. You've struggled, haven't you? Since James died? I know you've been seeing a therapist. I know you've had difficulty sleeping. I know Claire has mentioned that Mommy cries sometimes. That's all very understandable given your loss, but it does raise questions about stability. My blood went cold. She had been gathering information, building a case, positioning herself to present me as unfit based on the normal symptoms of grief. I felt my face flush with anger I couldn't yet articulate. I'm grieving my husband. That doesn't make me unstable. Of course not, Catherine agreed smoothly. But grief can impair judgment. It can make us unable to see clearly what our children need. I'm simply offering an alternative, a supportive, structured environment where Claire can flourish without the weight of your understandable struggles. She slid a folder across the table. I had my attorneys draft a preliminary agreement. You would retain legal custody, but Claire would reside with me during the school year. You'd have generous visitation, and of course, all expenses related to her care would be covered by the family. It's really quite reasonable. I opened the folder and scanned the first page. Generous visitation meant alternating weekends and 1 month in summer. My daughter would become a visitor in my life, a guest scheduled around the convenience of people who believed they owned her by virtue of their last name. I closed the folder and met Catherine's gaze. No. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I understand this is difficult to hear, Margot. Take some time to think about it. Discuss it with your attorney if you'd like. But I do hope you'll consider what's genuinely best for Claire rather than what's emotionally easiest for you. I stood, my legs somehow steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. I don't need time to think about it. The answer is no. Claire is my daughter. She's staying with me. Catherine remained seated, still composed, still certain of her position. Then I suppose we'll have to pursue this through formal channels. I had hoped to avoid that, for Claire's sake. Legal proceedings can be so distressing for children. The implication was clear. If I didn't cooperate, she would make this ugly, public, damaging. She would use her resources and connections to paint me as unstable, unsuitable, overwhelmed. And she would do it all while claiming to act in Claire's best interest. I left the Metropolitan Club and walked 6 blocks before I realized I was walking in the wrong direction. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall in front of anyone who might report back to Catherine. I found a coffee shop and sat in a back corner booth, staring at my phone and trying to breathe. The woman who had just threatened to take my child had done so over tea and finger sandwiches with perfect manners and concern etched into every word. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't been cruel in any way that would leave marks. But she had been absolutely clear: submit or be destroyed. I called my attorney, a family law specialist named Robertson who had handled the estate paperwork after James died. I explained what had happened, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. Robert listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Margot, he said finally, this is serious. If she's already involving the family trust attorneys, she's been planning this for a while. We need to act quickly. Can she actually do this? I asked. Can she take Claire from me based on some clause in a trust document? She can try, Robert said carefully. Whether she'd succeed depends on a lot of factors: the specific language in the trust, her ability to demonstrate that you're genuinely unfit, which is a very high bar, and honestly, whether the judge is impressed by the Sinclair name or annoyed by the presumption. But the fact that she's willing to try tells me she believes she has leverage. I spent the next 72 hours in a state of controlled panic, gathering documents, writing timelines, preparing for a battle I never imagined I'd have to fight. Robert advised me to document everything, every interaction with Catherine, every visit with Claire, every aspect of my daughter's routine that demonstrated stability and appropriate care. She's going to try to paint you as emotionally unstable, he said. So we need to show that you're functioning well, that Claire is thriving, that grief hasn't impaired your parenting. I resented the implication that I needed to prove I deserved my own child, but I understood the game being played. This wasn't about truth or justice, it was about presentation and resources. And Catherine had unlimited resources. What she didn't have, I realized, was complete information about me. She had assumed I would be passive, overwhelmed, willing to accept whatever arrangement she offered rather than risk public conflict. She had built her strategy around my presumed weakness. But she had underestimated one crucial detail: I was Claire's mother, and there was nothing I wouldn't do to protect her. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in a family court that handled custody disputes and trust oversight matters. I arrived early, dressed in clothing Robert had helped me select, professional but not expensive, put together but not trying too hard. Catherine arrived with 2 attorneys, both from firms whose names appeared on buildings downtown. She wore Armani and pearls and an expression of maternal concern that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't heard her calmly threaten me over tea. The hearing was technically about establishing temporary custody arrangements, while the trust provisions were examined in detail. Catherine's lead attorney, a man named Harrison Whitfield who spoke in the cadenced tones of someone who went to the right schools and never forgot it, presented his case with polished efficiency. He outlined the trust provisions that gave Catherine consultative authority regarding Claire's upbringing. He mentioned my recent therapy sessions, information obtained God knows how, and suggested they indicated emotional fragility that might impair my judgment. He emphasized the advantages Catherine could provide and painted me as a loving but limited parent unable to properly prepare Claire for the life she was entitled to. Robert countered by pointing out that therapy after losing a spouse was healthy and appropriate, that I had maintained stable employment and a stable home, and that Claire showed no signs of neglect or distress. He also noted that Catherine's interpretation of the trust language was extremely broad and that consultative authority didn't translate to custody rights. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Sarah Brennan who looked tired of wealthy people problems, listened to both sides and asked pointed questions that suggested she wasn't particularly impressed by anyone in the room. "Mr. Whitfield," she said during a pause in his presentation, "you're asking this court to remove a child from her mother's care based on the assertion that the mother, who by all accounts is employed, stable and loving, isn't sufficiently, what's the word you used? Positioned? To provide the lifestyle outlined in a trust document." Whitfield adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, the trust was established with specific intentions regarding the upbringing of Sinclair heirs. Those intentions reflect generations of family wisdom about what constitutes appropriate preparation for what?" Judge Brennan interrupted. "A life of luxury? Because this court's primary concern is the child's welfare, not her social calendar." I watched Catherine's expression remain perfectly neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, irritation maybe, or the first hint of concern that this wasn't going to be as straightforward as she'd anticipated. The judge ultimately declined to grant temporary custody to Catherine, noting that there was no evidence of immediate harm to the child and that the trust provisions in question required further legal analysis. She scheduled a follow-up hearing for 2 months later and advised both parties to consider mediation as a less adversarial path forward. Catherine smiled graciously and thanked the judge as if the ruling had gone in her favor. But I saw the tightness around her mouth, the way her attorney leaned in to whisper reassurances as we left the courtroom. She had expected to win, and she hadn't. That 2-month window became a campaign. Catherine began requesting more frequent visits with Claire, documenting everything we did together, asking questions designed to elicit responses she could later use as evidence of my inadequacy. She invited Claire to exclusive events, museum galas, charity luncheons, sailing trips with appropriate families, and made sure I knew about all the opportunities one was preventing my daughter from having by keeping her in my ordinary life. I let some of the visits happen because refusing everything would look like parental alienation, but I also started keeping my own records. I documented every conversation, every visit, every subtle attempt to undermine me in Claire's eyes. Then I found it. I was going through James's old files, boxes of paperwork I'd been avoiding since his death, looking for documents Robert thought might be relevant to the trust dispute. Buried in a folder marked Estate Planning 2015 was a letter James had written but never sent. It was addressed to his attorney and dated 2 years before he died. In it, he outlined his wishes regarding Claire's upbringing in the event something happened to him. The language was specific: I want Claire raised by her mother without interference from my family. I've seen how my mother's expectations damaged my own childhood, how the pressure to perform and conform made it impossible to simply be myself. I don't want that for my daughter. Margot understands what it means to be valued for who you are rather than what you represent. If anything happens to me, I want the trust structured in a way that protects Claire's financial future but doesn't give my mother any authority over her daily life. Margot is the best parent Claire could have, and my mother's disapproval of her background is exactly the kind of snobbery I hope Claire never learns. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. James had known. He had understood his mother's nature and wanted to protect us from it. But the letter had never been sent, never been incorporated into the formal estate documents, never been made legally binding. It was just words on paper expressing wishes that had died with him. I showed it to Robert. "This changes things," he said immediately. "It won't override the trust language, but it's powerful evidence of James's intent. It shows that he explicitly didn't want his mother involved in Claire's upbringing. That matters." I felt something shift inside me, not hope exactly, but determination. I had been playing defense, trying to prove I was good enough, stable enough, suitable enough. But I didn't need to prove anything. I needed to show who Catherine actually was beneath the pearls and polish. I started investigating. Not hiring private detectives or doing anything dramatic, just looking closely at the public record, at the foundation Catherine chaired, at the charitable organizations where she held board positions. What I found was a pattern of behavior that looked generous on the surface but functioned as control. The foundation gave scholarships to promising young people, but recipients were required to attend specific schools, pursue specific careers, maintain relationships with foundation advisors who monitored their progress and life choices. One former recipient had written a blog post about feeling like a project rather than a person, about the constant pressure to perform gratitude and conform to expectations that had nothing to do with her actual dreams. The foundation had threatened legal action over the post, claiming defamation, and the young woman had taken it down. But I found cached versions, saved copies, digital footprints that revealed a pattern. Catherine didn't mentor people, she collected them, shaped them, controlled them through the power of her resources and the threat of withdrawal. She had tried to do the same thing to me during my marriage, and now she was attempting it with my daughter. I gave all of this to Robert. "We can't use this directly," he said. "It's not evidence in a custody matter. But it establishes pattern of behavior. And if we can get some of these former scholarship recipients to speak on record about their experiences, it paints a picture of who Catherine Sinclair really is when she's helping someone." We found 3 people willing to talk, all of them adults now, all of them still carrying some level of anger about the way they'd been treated. Their stories were consistent: initial generosity, escalating control, demands for compliance, threats when they tried to establish independence. One woman described it as benevolent imprisonment, which struck me as exactly right. The follow-up hearing approached. Robert had built a case that went beyond defending my adequacy to questioning whether Catherine's involvement in Claire's life would actually be beneficial or harmful. We had James's letter expressing his wishes. We had testimony from people who had experienced Catherine's particular brand of controlling charity. We had documentation of every attempt she'd made to undermine me and appropriate my role as Claire's mother. What we didn't have was any guarantee that it would matter to a judge who might be more impressed by Catherine's pedigree than concerned about her methods. The night before the hearing, I sat with Claire while she did her homework at the kitchen table, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she worked on a math problem. She was 6 years old, brilliant and funny and kind, completely unaware that adults were fighting over her as if she were property to be allocated. I watched her and felt the weight of everything I stood to lose. "Mom," she said without looking up from her worksheet. "Yeah, sweetheart. Grandma Catherine says I'm special because I'm a Sinclair. Is that true?" My chest tightened. "You're special because you're you, Claire. Not because of your last name." She looked up at me with James's eyes and her own fierce intelligence. "That's what I thought," she said. "Grandma talks about names a lot. It's kind of boring." I laughed despite everything. "Yeah," I agreed. "It really is." The hearing the next day was longer and more intense than the preliminary session. Harrison Whitfield presented an expanded version of his earlier arguments, emphasizing the trust provisions and the educational advantages Catherine could provide. He brought character witnesses, headmasters from elite schools, foundation board members, society figures, who testified to Catherine's impeccable judgment and dedication to family legacy. It was impressive in the way a museum exhibit is impressive, beautiful, expensive, fundamentally lifeless. When it was our turn, Robert called me to testify first. I explained my relationship with James, my efforts to honor his memory while also allowing Claire to be herself, my grief and how I was managing it in healthy ways. I was asked about therapy, and I answered honestly, yes, I was seeing a therapist, because losing my husband was devastating and I wanted to process that grief in ways that wouldn't burden my daughter. I was asked about finances, and I explained that I worked as a project manager for a tech nonprofit, that I earned enough to support us comfortably, that I didn't need Catherine's money, just her distance. Then Robert introduced James's letter. He read it aloud in the quiet courtroom, and I watched Catherine's face remain perfectly composed except for the slightest tightening around her eyes. When he finished, he looked directly at her. Mrs. Sinclair, were you aware that your son explicitly didn't want you involved in his daughter's upbringing? Catherine's attorney objected immediately, but the judge allowed the question. Catherine smiled sadly. James wrote many things over the years. He was a sensitive person, sometimes overly emotional. I loved my son, but he didn't always think clearly about practical matters. Robert didn't push it. Instead, he called his witnesses, the 3 former scholarship recipients who had agreed to speak. They were nervous, clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting, but they told their stories with quiet conviction. They described how Catherine's generosity came with strings, how her help transformed into control, how questioning her guidance led to punishment disguised as disappointed concern. The last witness, a woman named Priya who is now a civil rights attorney, looked directly at Catherine while she spoke. Mrs. Sinclair told me I was special, that I had potential, that she saw something in me worth investing in. But what she actually wanted was to shape me into her vision of what I should be. When I chose law school instead of business school, when I took a job with a non-profit instead of a corporate firm, she withdrew all support and told people I had been ungrateful and disappointing. I spent years feeling like I had failed somehow. It took therapy, she glanced at me briefly, to realize that the failure was hers, not mine. She didn't want to help me succeed. She wanted to own my success. The courtroom was very quiet after that testimony. Judge Brennan asked Catherine's attorney if he wanted to cross-examine. He declined. What could he ask that wouldn't make it worse? The judge took a brief recess, and when she returned, her expression had shifted from tired tolerance to something sharper. I've reviewed the trust documents in question, she said. And I've listened carefully to the arguments presented by both sides. Here's what I understand. Mrs. Sinclair believes she has superior knowledge about how to raise a child in her social sphere. Mrs. Sinclair, she gestured to me, believes she has the right to raise her daughter according to her own values and her late husband's expressed wishes. This court is not in the business of determining which lifestyle is superior or whether private school is better than public school or whether attending charity galas makes someone a better human being. She looked at Catherine directly. What this court is concerned with is the welfare of a 6-year-old girl who has already lost her father and should not lose her mother to legal maneuvering disguised as concern. The ruling was comprehensive. Judge Brennan found that the trust language did not grant Catherine custody rights or any authority to override my parental decisions. She noted that James's letter, while not legally binding, clearly expressed his intent and should be given weight in interpreting ambiguous trust provisions. She acknowledged my grief and therapy as signs of appropriate coping rather than instability. And she made one additional ruling that I hadn't expected. She restricted Catherine's visitation to supervised sessions pending a psychological evaluation to determine whether her involvement in Claire's life was beneficial or harmful to the child. Catherine's face finally cracked, just slightly, a flash of genuine anger before the mask of composure reasserted itself. Her attorney immediately began discussing appeals, but Judge Brennan cut him off. Mr. Whitfield, you can appeal if you wish. But I'm going to be very clear about something. This court will not facilitate the removal of a child from a fit parent because that parent doesn't meet your client's social standards. If Mrs. Catherine Sinclair wants a relationship with her granddaughter, she can pursue it through appropriate channels while respecting Mrs. Margot Sinclair's role as Claire's mother. This hearing is concluded. I walked out of that courtroom into afternoon sunlight that felt different somehow, sharper, cleaner, real. Robert was grinning in his restrained attorney way. "We won," he said. "Decisively." I nodded, not quite ready to believe it wouldn't be snatched away again. Catherine exited with her legal team, walking past me without acknowledgement, her posture perfect and her expression unreadable. But I noticed her hands clenched around her handbag, knuckles white with suppressed fury. She had expected to win through sheer force of will and resources, and she had been denied by a judge who wasn't impressed by either. The appeals never materialized. Catherine's attorneys apparently advised her that pursuing this further would only generate publicity that would damage her reputation more than mine. The psychological evaluation never happened because Catherine declined to submit to it, which meant her supervised visits never began either. She simply withdrew. No more invitations, no more phone calls, no more attempts to insert herself into Claire's life. It was as if we had been erased from her world entirely, which was fine by me. Claire asked about Grandma Catherine a few times in the months that followed. I told her that Grandma was very busy and that sometimes adults have disagreements that make it hard to spend time together, but it wasn't Claire's fault and she was loved. Claire seemed to accept this with the resilient adaptability of children. She missed her grandmother for about 2 weeks, then got distracted by a school project about planets and never mentioned her again. I realized that children don't actually need wealth or connections or social position. They need stability, love, and the freedom to develop into whoever they're meant to be without constant performance requirements. 6 months after the final ruling, I received a brief letter from Catherine's estate attorney informing me that the trust had been restructured to provide directly for Claire's education and future needs without requiring any ongoing relationship with Catherine or oversight from the family. The money would be held in a properly managed trust that I couldn't touch but that would fund Claire's legitimate needs without strings attached. It was the closest Catherine would ever come to admitting defeat. I kept James's unsent letter in a safety deposit box along with the court transcripts and documentation from the case. Someday when Claire is old enough to understand, I'll show her all of it, not to poison her against her grandmother's memory, but to help her understand that love without respect is just another form of control. I'll tell her about her father's wishes, about his recognition that money and status aren't the same as character or worth. I'll tell her that he chose me specifically because I came from a different world, because I valued different things, because I wouldn't raise her to believe that her last name defined her value. 2 years have passed now. Claire is 8, thriving in her public school where she has friends who don't know or care that she's a Sinclair heir. She takes piano lessons and plays soccer and reads everything she can get her hands on. She's brilliant and kind and completely herself in ways that would have been systematically trained out of her if Catherine had succeeded. I still see a therapist, though now we talk less about grief and more about building a life that honors what I've learned from surviving loss and fighting battles I never wanted to fight. Sometimes late at night, I think about that tea service at the Metropolitan Club, the moment Catherine informed me I was insufficient and expected me to simply accept her judgment. I think about how close I came to believing her, to internalizing the idea that love without resources wasn't enough. And then I look at my daughter, sleeping peacefully with a stack of library books on her nightstand, and I know with absolute certainty that Catherine was wrong about everything that mattered. I didn't win because I had better attorneys or more compelling evidence, though those things helped. I won because I was fighting for something real, my daughter's right to be loved without conditions, to be valued for who she is rather than what she represents, to grow up free from the suffocating weight of other people's expectations. Catherine was fighting for control, for legacy, for the perpetuation of a system that measures human worth by inherited advantage. And when those two motivations collided in front of a judge who understood the difference, control lost. It had to lose. Because the alternative would have been a world where children are property to be allocated to the highest bidder, where love is subordinate to status, where being born correctly matters more than being raised well. I rebuilt my life around clarity and boundaries. I let go of the need to be accepted by people who would never value me. I stopped apologizing for my background or my choices or my perfectly appropriate grief. I raised my daughter to understand that character isn't inherited, it's built through choices, through integrity, through the courage to define yourself rather than accepting someone else's definition. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's narrative about your inadequacy. Catherine wanted me to believe I wasn't enough. She deployed every weapon in her considerable arsenal: money, connections, institutional power, the weight of generations of accumulated privilege, to make me accept that assessment. But she made one critical miscalculation: she assumed that her judgment mattered more than my daughter's needs. And when forced to choose between pleasing my daughter's grandmother and protecting my daughter's soul, there was no choice at all. Claire will inherit money someday, the trust James established and the structures his family built to preserve wealth across generations. But what she's inherited from me is something Catherine could never give her: the understanding that she's valuable not because of what she has, but because of who she is. And that inheritance, the one that can't be measured in dollars or evaluated by attorneys, is the one that will actually sustain her through whatever life brings.